Well, first tonight, we are learning and we are hearing from the grandmother of a 9-year-old girl who was shot and killed Monday night. The girl's mom was also shot but survived.
Fox 26's Dominic Keith joining us live from downtown Houston.
On June 13th, 2022, inside a third-floor apartment in Houston, 9-year-old Khylie Sorrells and her mother were suddenly ambushed in what should have been the safest place for them, their home. Khylie suffered a fatal gunshot wound to the head in what police later described as an execution-style attack, while her mother, Brittany, was shot in the shoulder. Khylie was pronounced dead just 37 days before her 10th birthday. This is the story of a young girl whose life was taken by Jeremiah Jones, the man Brittany Sorrells had ended a relationship with just 2 months before the incident. A man with a criminal record stretching back to when he was 12 years old. At the time of the incident, he was walking free on not 1 or 2 but 5 separate active counts in Houston, Texas. Prosecutors have specifically flagged, given the judge every legal reason to keep him behind bar. Instead, he was released. And what followed next didn't begin with sympathy. It began with questions. Loud ones. Accusations. And a wave of public judgment that no one expected. But here's where this story takes a turn that's hard to ignore. Before we go any further, if you're watching right now, take a second to subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Khylie Sorrells was just 9 years old, at a stage in life where every day still carried a sense of excitement. She lived in Houston, Texas, with her mother and siblings, in a home that, despite its challenges, was filled with the kind of energy only children can bring. She wasn't quiet or withdrawn. Khylie had a presence, the kind of child who could walk into a room and instantly shift the mood. She loved basketball, and not casually. She played with confidence, with drive, and with a level of focus that stood out for someone her age. On her team, she wasn't just another player. She was recognized as one of the best. Coaches saw potential in her. Teammates looked up to her. For Khylie, the court wasn't just a place to play. It was where she expressed herself, where she felt strong, and where her competitive side came alive. Away from sports, she was very much a child of her generation. She enjoyed making TikTok videos, often recording short clips, laughing, dancing, and sharing moments with the people around her. It was her way of having fun, of being creative, and of connecting with her siblings. Those small clips captured something simple but important: joy, confidence, and a personality that was still growing. At home, Khylie took her role as a big sister seriously. She was protective, attentive, and naturally caring. Whether it was helping out, playing with her siblings, or just being present, she carried herself in a way that showed maturity beyond her years. Her bond with them wasn't forced. It was natural. She was someone they could rely on, someone who made them feel safe. Her mother, Brittany Sorrells, was at the center of her world. Like many single parents, Brittany was balancing responsibilities, raising her children, managing daily life, and trying to create stability. Despite everything, there was a clear connection between her and Khylie. They spent time together, shared space, and built routines that felt normal. Moments like sitting in bed watching a movie weren't unusual. They were part of their everyday life. And in many ways, that's what makes this story so difficult to process. Nothing about Khylie's life suggested that it would end the way it did. She had interests, routines, and relationships that were still developing. She had plans for school, for basketball, for the next day, the next week, things that now remain unfinished. For a moment, think about a 9-year-old laughing into a phone camera, trying to get the perfect angle for a short video, pausing, replaying it, and laughing again with her siblings beside her. That was Khylie. Jeremiah Jones was not a stranger to Kylie's family. For a period of time, he had been part of their everyday life, someone who had access to their home, their space, and their routines. He was in a relationship with Kylie's mother, Brittany Sorrells, for several months, and during that time, he became a familiar presence around the children. The relationship lasted for about 8 months. On the surface, it may have seemed like a typical adult relationship, 2 people trying to build something together. But beneath that, there were signs that things were not stable. The connection between Brittany and Jeremiah eventually broke down, and the relationship ended roughly 2 months before the night of the shooting. For many people, a breakup marks a clean separation. But in this case, it didn't. Even after things ended, Jeremiah didn't fully remove himself from Brittany's life. There was still contact, still tension, and more importantly, unresolved emotions that hadn't settled. That lingering connection created a situation where boundaries were unclear, and that can often lead to problems. One of the earliest warning signs came in the form of jealousy. Jeremiah reportedly believed Brittany was seeing someone else after their breakup. That belief didn't stay as a passing thought, it turned into accusations. And those accusations began to shape his behavior. There were also signs of control. The kind that doesn't always start loudly, but builds over time. Wanting to know who she was talking to, questioning her choices, reacting emotionally when things didn't go his way. These behaviors can sometimes be dismissed in the moment, but they often point to something deeper, an inability to let go, and a need to maintain influence even after a relationship has ended. But the most serious warning came just days before everything escalated. According to Brittany's statement, about a week before the shooting, Jeremiah showed up at her apartment with a gun and threatened her life. This wasn't a vague argument or a heated exchange. This was a direct, dangerous situation involving a weapon. That moment should have changed everything. It showed that the situation had already crossed into a level of risk that was no longer just emotional. It was physical, immediate, and unpredictable. When a weapon enters the picture, the stakes shift completely. And yet, life continued. The routines didn't stop. The children were still at home. Daily life carried on, even with that threat hanging in the background. Situations like this can be difficult to navigate, especially when emotions, history, and familiarity are involved. But what's important here is how quickly things can escalate once that line has been crossed. Because when someone struggles to accept the end of a relationship, especially when jealousy is involved, their actions can become more intense. What starts as accusations can turn into confrontation. And confrontation, when combined with anger and access to a weapon, can become something far more dangerous. Inside the apartment, Khylie Sorrells was in bed with her children, including Khylie. The lights were low, a movie playing, the kind of moment that doesn't feel important at the time but later becomes impossible to forget. Everyone was close together, relaxed, focused on the screen. There was no indication that anything was about to go wrong. But there was one small detail, something easy to overlook. The front door had been left unlocked. Earlier that evening, a cousin had been moving in and out of the apartment, going back and forth, and at some point, the door simply wasn't secured again. It wasn't unusual. It didn't seem dangerous. Just one of those everyday things that happens without a second thought. Until it mattered. Without warning, Jeremiah Jones walked in. There was no knock, no announcement, just sudden presence. The shift in the room was immediate. What had been calm seconds earlier was now tense. Brittany recognized him instantly, and from the way he entered, it was clear he wasn't there to talk things out. He was already angry. The focus quickly turned to a television inside the apartment. Jeremiah claimed it belonged to him, and within moments he began pulling it off the wall. The situation escalated fast. What started as a demand turned into force. The sound of the TV being ripped down cut through the room, breaking whatever sense of normalcy was left. But it didn't stop there. His attention shifted back to Brittany. He accused her of seeing another man. The tone wasn't calm, and it wasn't a conversation, it was confrontation. His words carried frustration, jealousy, and something more intense beneath it. Brittany tried to manage the situation, but there was no reasoning with him in that moment. Then he demanded her phone. It wasn't a request, it was an order. Brittany handed it over. At that point, the priority wasn't the argument anymore. It was keeping the situation from getting worse. Every second felt uncertain. Every movement mattered. The children were still there, still watching, still present in a situation they didn't fully understand, but could feel was no longer safe. Then Jeremiah began moving, not toward the door, not away from the situation. He moved deeper into the apartment, toward the bedroom. And in that moment, something shifted again. Because Khylie was in that room, Brittany saw him heading in that direction, and there was a realization, fast, sharp, immediate, that this wasn't just about an argument anymore. This was something else, something that had gone too far. The distance between them suddenly felt too long, the time too short. Then, he walked into the room where Khylie was. The moment he stepped into that room, everything that had been building up finally reached its breaking point. Just the sound of gunfire. The first shot rang out from inside the bedroom, loud enough to cut through everything. Through the walls, through the tension, through the confusion. For a split second, it didn't even feel real. Then the second shot followed, just as sudden, just as final. Brittany moved instantly. There was no hesitation, no pause to process what she had just heard. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up. She rushed toward the room, driven by something deeper than fear, by instinct, by urgency, by the need to reach her child. When she got there, the scene in front of her was something no parent should ever have to see. Khylie was on the floor, unresponsive. The room that had just moments ago been a place of comfort was now completely changed. The silence that followed the gunshots felt heavier than the noise itself. Everything seemed to stop at once. In that moment, everything changed. There was no time to fully understand it, no space to process the reality of what had just happened. Brittany's focus was on her daughter, trying to reach her, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, trying to hold on to the hope that somehow this wasn't what it looked like. But before she could even react further, Jeremiah came back out of the room. And then, without warning, he turned the gun on her. The shot hit her in the shoulder. The impact forced her back, adding physical pain to a moment that was already overwhelming. Now, she wasn't just trying to save her daughter, she was injured herself, bleeding, disoriented, but still conscious. And still there. Jeremiah didn't stay. After firing that shot, he left the apartment, walking away from the scene he had just created. No attempt to help, no hesitation, just gone. Inside the apartment, the aftermath was immediate and devastating. The other children were still there. They hadn't been physically harmed, but they were present in those moments, close enough to hear what happened, close enough to feel the shift from safety to fear in seconds. For them, the night didn't just end in loss. It became something they would carry with them moving forward. Brittany, despite her injury, pushed through the pain. She made her way back to Khylie, trying to help her, trying to get a response, trying to hold on to anything that could change the outcome. Every second mattered, but everything was moving too fast and not fast enough at the same time. Emergency services were called. But by the time help arrived, the damage had already been done. Kylie's injuries were too severe. The same child who had been laughing, playing, and living her life just hours earlier was now gone. The apartment that once held normal routines had become the center of a tragedy that no one in that family could have prepared for. And as the reality of what happened began to settle in, the questions started to form. Not just about how it happened, but whether it could have been stopped. Do you think warning signs were ignored here? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. In the hours that followed, the scene inside the apartment shifted from chaos to procedure. Officers secured the area, separated witnesses, and began gathering the details that would shape the case. What stood out immediately was that this wasn't a mystery in terms of identity. The suspect was known. Brittany had already identified Jeremiah Jones as the man who came into the apartment, argued with her, and fired the shots. There was no uncertainty about who was responsible. That clarity allowed investigators to move quickly, focusing their efforts on locating him and confirming the sequence of events. Given the seriousness of what had happened, a child killed and another victim injured, law enforcement treated the case with urgency. Information was shared across units, and the search for Jeremiah intensified within a short period of time. He was eventually taken into custody. With his arrest, the case moved into a more formal stage. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence, and the charges reflected the severity of the crime. Jeremiah Jones was charged with capital murder for the death of Khylie Sorrells, along with aggravated assault for the shooting of Brittany. Those charges carry significant weight, and they signaled that authorities were pursuing the case at the highest level. But as more information surfaced, another detail began to draw attention, one that raised difficult questions. At the time of the shooting, Jeremiah was already out on bond for a separate case. That fact introduced a different layer to the story. It wasn't just about what happened inside that apartment, it also brought attention to the system surrounding it. Being out on bond means an individual has been released while awaiting further legal proceedings, under the expectation that they will not pose a threat. In this situation, that expectation clearly didn't hold. It raised concerns about how risk is assessed, how decisions are made regarding release, and whether more could have been done to prevent someone with prior legal issues and recent threats involving a weapon from being in a position to carry out such an act. For investigators, the focus remained on building a strong case, documenting the events, collecting statements, and preparing for prosecution. But while police were building their case, something else was happening online. While investigators focused on the case, the story began to spread beyond Houston. News reports circulated, clips were shared, and within hours the incident reached a much wider audience. As more people heard about what happened, reactions started pouring in across social media. At first, the responses followed a familiar pattern: shock, sadness, and anger directed at the man responsible. A child had lost her life, and for many, that alone was enough to define the situation. But then, the tone began to shift. Questions started appearing in comment sections, not about the suspect, but about the mother. Why was the door unlocked? Why was he still around after the breakup? Why didn't she stop him? The focus slowly moved away from the person who pulled the trigger and toward someone who had just survived the same attack. And once that shift began, it spread quickly. People who had never met Brittany, who had no direct understanding of the full situation, began forming conclusions based on fragments of information. Some assumed negligence, others framed it as a failure to act sooner. The conversation became less about what happened and more about what should have been done differently. This is where the case took on a different kind of weight, not just as a crime, but as a reflection of how quickly public judgment can take shape. In situations like this, it's easy to look back and identify moments that seem important in hindsight: the unlocked door, the previous threat, the continued contact after the relationship ended. When viewed after the fact, those details stand out. But real life doesn't happen in hindsight. Decisions are made in real time, often under pressure, often without complete clarity. And in many cases, people don't fully recognize the level of danger until it's too late. What played out online was an example of how quickly blame can shift when a situation is emotionally charged. Instead of focusing solely on the individual who committed the act, attention turned toward someone who was also a victim. It raises a difficult question. Why does that happen? Part of it comes from the need to make sense of something that feels senseless. When a tragedy involves a child, people look for explanations, something that can make the outcome feel less random. Assigning blame can create the illusion of control, as if identifying a mistake could somehow explain or prevent what happened. But that process can also lead to unfair conclusions, because it overlooks the reality of how situations like this unfold. It ignores the complexity of relationships, the unpredictability of behavior, and the fact that not every warning sign is understood in the moment. There's also the distance factor. When people are removed from a situation, it becomes easier to analyze it as a series of decisions rather than lived experiences. The emotional weight, the fear, the uncertainty, all of that is reduced to a few key details. And those details get judged. What this case revealed wasn't just the impact of a violent act. It showed how quickly public perception can form, and how that perception can shift the focus away from where it belongs. Because at the center of all of this was a child who lost her life, and a mother who survived something no parent should ever have to experience. Yet, instead of only receiving support, she found herself at the center of a different kind of scrutiny. One that continues to shape how people view the case. When you look at what led up to that night, after the relationship between Brittany and Jeremiah ended, there were signs that he struggled to accept that separation. Reports indicate he believed she was seeing someone else, and that belief became a driving force behind his actions. Jealousy, in situations like this, doesn't stay contained. It grows, feeding off assumptions and emotions rather than confirmed facts. From there, it can shift into control. Control doesn't always show up in obvious ways at first. It can appear as questioning, accusations, or attempts to stay involved in someone's life after the relationship has ended. In this case, even after the breakup, Jeremiah maintained contact, and that ongoing connection created opportunities for conflict to continue. Breakups can be a major trigger in situations like this, especially when one person is not ready to let go. The loss of control over a relationship, combined with feelings of rejection, can create a sense of urgency, an attempt to regain influence or assert dominance in a situation that has already ended. In this case, that escalation moved quickly, from suspicion to confrontation to a direct threat involving a gun, and finally, to violence. What stands out is that the warning signs were present. Not hidden, not subtle, but clear enough to show that the situation had already crossed into a dangerous space before that night. Understanding this pattern is important because it highlights how these situations develop. They don't usually begin with violence. They build toward it, step by step, with each stage becoming more serious than the last. And when those stages are not interrupted, the outcome can be exactly what happened here: sudden, devastating, and impossible to reverse. When a story like this ends, the instinct is to look for a single moment that could have changed everything. But in reality, cases like this are rarely about one moment. They're about a series of moments that build over time. One of the clearest takeaways here is how warning signs can appear before violence ever happens. In this case, there were already indications that the situation had moved beyond a normal disagreement. A previous threat involving a firearm wasn't just an argument, it was a signal that the level of risk had increased. When a weapon is introduced, the situation shifts from emotional tension to immediate danger. Another important factor is how difficult it can be to respond to those warning signs in real time. People often expect clear decisions in hindsight: leave immediately, cut off all contact, take action right away. But real situations are more complicated. Emotions, shared history, and everyday responsibilities can make it harder to fully separate or recognize how serious things have become. Children, in situations like this, are often the most vulnerable, and sometimes the least considered when people think about the impact of relationship conflict. They are not part of the disagreement, but they are present in the environment where it unfolds. That proximity can place them at risk, even when they are not the intended target. In this case, Khylie became the victim of a situation that developed between adults, highlighting how quickly that risk can extend beyond its original focus. There's also the role of community awareness. People close to a situation, friends, relatives, even neighbors, can sometimes notice changes or tension before things escalate. While it's not always clear what action should be taken, open communication and taking concerns seriously can make a difference. Silence or uncertainty can allow situations to continue without interruption. The system itself is another part of this conversation. The fact that Jeremiah was out on bond at the time raises questions about how risk is assessed and managed. Being released while awaiting further legal proceedings carries an expectation of safety, but in this case that expectation didn't hold. It points to a gap that can have real consequences when individuals with a history of threats still have access to others. Ultimately, this case shows how quickly situations can move from tension to irreversible outcomes. It's not about assigning blame after the fact. It's about understanding how these patterns develop and recognizing that early action, when possible, can be critical. Because once that line is crossed, there's no opportunity to go back and change it. Khylie wasn't defined by what happened to her. She was defined by who she was before it, by her energy, her interests, and the role she played in her family. Those are the parts of her story that mattered just as much as the events that brought attention to her name. What remains now is the impact of her absence, a space that can't be filled, a future that won't unfold the way it should have, and a reminder of how quickly everything can change. If this story moved you, take a moment to engage with it, like this video, share it with someone, and subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles for more real stories that matter. Your voice also matters here. What are your thoughts on this case? Drop them in the comments below. Conversations like these help bring awareness, and awareness can make a difference.